I'm going to teach you how to simply increase your potential and your personal power. We're going to do this through identifying the center of our lives and making small shifts to increase our limits. So I'm Carolyn Chilia. I am a clinical hypnotherapist, NLP practitioner, EFT instructor. I am an osteopathic manual practitioner, kinesiologist, fascial stretch therapy. In short, I connect to the mind and the body. I have a deep, deep love for subconscious mind and all things around that. So in this short video, I'm just going to teach you what people can be centered around, what you might be centered around. In me explaining these, we can identify what your center of your life is, and then from there we can make a shift to, I'm going to teach you a much, I believe, better way to view your life and keep your center around principles. So in this, we might be able to identify where we have high priorities for certain things in our lives, but we want to think about what do we put at the very center of our life. So just listen closely and see where you may fall. Okay, so the center of our life is the highest priority. So some people could be self-centered. A self-centered person is just someone who puts their needs above all else. So being self-centered just means that when you're considering making decisions, yourself is the most important. So your security or your insecurity would be changing all the time because your wants and needs shift and change throughout your life. So it's a self-centered person does have varying security. So you might see them one day very, very secure and confident, another day very insecure and confident. Their guidance comes from asking themselves questions like, what do I feel like doing today? Would this benefit me? Do I want to do this? What do I need? So very, very self at the center. The way that they make judgments is based on usually mood. So yes, personality, but usually their judgments are based on mood. And their perspective is very, very limited because they view the world and their decisions through events and circumstances that have happened to them, right? So that is their limited perspective. Now, their power comes solely from how can they access the resources that they need to produce a feeling of satisfaction. So to put that in simpler terms, how can they fulfill their needs? And then that's where their power comes. And you can see where you would get very, very limited in that because you don't have the benefits of other people in your network because you are self-centered. So it's there's no energy flow. It's always receiving and never giving. Now other people might be spouse-centered. So let's move on to spouse-centered. And spouse-centered happens for a lot of people who get into a long-term partnership. Now their security comes from how their partner responds to them. So the security comes from how well is their marriage doing. And your guidance and all of your decisions are based on how will this affect my mate? How will this affect my marriage? What are my partner's needs and what are my needs within this relationship? And you can see how your power would be completely limited because your power is dependent on the wants and needs of another person or yourself in that relationship. And that is affected by all of the faults of yourself and your partner, which are always many, right? Another way to be centered is family-centered. And family-centered is a very ingrained way of life, and you might see even culturally how entire cultures are very family-centered. And so family-centered security or insecurity comes from your family's reputation. So your family's acceptance as well. So how well are you accepted into your family and fulfilling their expectations? And so then your security or insecurity about doing something would be based on your family's expectations of you, right? And then your guidance or your decision making is all based on, what does my family expect of me? And does this fit the role that my family has laid out for me? In some cases, this can be very, very drastic. You can be thinking of models of families that expect you to do certain things, behave certain ways because of your gender, go into certain careers or make a certain amount of money, behave in a certain way. And then you can see how, if that, even in that extreme case, your life is completely limited by your family's expectations and your family's models of life. This can be more subtle. This can be something like, my family, it's expected in my family that we're married before we have a child. It's expected in my family that the older siblings take care of the younger siblings. Those things are still family-centered perspective. They're just a little bit more subtle and maybe aren't screaming out in your face. So consider those things. Where do you work to fulfill your family's expectations? And so again, so your actions are completely limited on what is expected of your family or what is not expected of you from your family, right? So another centered way to be is money centered. And so we see this out in the world a lot. So even I find money centered and work centered sometimes get mixed. So let's start with money centered. Money centered, that your security and your confidence comes from simply your personal worth, net worth. So how much money are you making? And then your confidence and your security will be coming from that position alone, right? So you're guided only by what makes you profit. Your wisdom or your life perspective is all about money making. So you only value actions or things that humans do based on if they make money for you or for them, right? So you can see where you would be completely limited in your potential and your power because you're completely restricted by what you accomplish solely based on income or money coming into your life. Now, work-centered, similar, but the security comes not by how much money you're making, but your role or your position within either the community or your organization. So that's where your confidence, your security, your self-worth comes from, is where am I in the company, or where am I in my community? Is this a well-respected role? And then all of your guidance, your decision making, everything that you base that on is solely on the needs and expectations of your work or your role, your occupation. And then your life perspective comes from your work role. So you see the entire world based on your position in either your company or your position in the community. There's no expansion outwards. And then you can see where you would be limited because you would limit yourself in, what does someone who doesn't do my job do? What are my occupational requirements? What are my organization's expectations? So you would put yourself in this little box. Now, there are a few others that I find are less common. A few other centered ways to be that are less common. So possession centered. It's very similar to money, but it is possession centered. So your reputation is not based on how much money you make, but what you have. So you can see the subtle differences between those. Although similar, they are different because you don't need to be making the money, but as long as you have the things, right? So that's where your worth is based. So sometimes this can come from if we have like an inheritance or someone taking care of us, but as long as we have the possessions, then our worth is there. So it's not, even if we're producing it, if someone's giving it to us, that's fine. But so that's where your security and your confidence comes from, is do you have all the things that you personally want? And then you make your decisions based on what would increase your possession, like what would increase you getting more possessions, or what would increase your ability to display to the world what possessions you have, if that makes sense. And then your life perspective is economic and social relationships. So your life perspective is all about how can I make these relationships, or how do these people view me, and how do I view those people based on possessions, based on what they have. And then we can label people depending on the things that they have. And that's where our perspective comes from. And you can see where you would be limited in that. So your social status or your confidence or everything is based on your possessions. So you're completely limited based on what possessions you can acquire. And generally with each acquisition, then we change our social status, and then we are then in a different way to compare, right? So that's like a never-ending cycle. Another way to be centered is pleasure-centered, and there isn't really security here, right? Because it's very short-lived, because you have to be having pleasure to be secure, and pleasure is in our life, we know, is in short bursts, right? We need to have that balance. So you make decisions based on what is going to be most pleasurable, what is going to be the most satisfying thing for you. So you see the world in terms of what is best for you. And so that is very similar to the self-centered, but it is very pleasure focused. So it is very focused on the things that actually like are very satisfying for you. And in this sense, you're limited by almost everything. So you don't really have any personal power.
Look at the huge gun.
Whoa. I'm just recording. Could you wait 1 minute?
Sure.
Thank you, love.
Did Grandma call?
She has not. I'll just be 1 second. So another way to be centered is through our enemy centered. So we usually this occurs partway through life, and then we unless it's instilled in a family model, but partway through life we have almost this break. We find an enemy, and if we are enemy centered, our security is volatile. So do we have a one-up on our enemy? And if we do, then we feel secure. If we don't, or we're plotting our next thing, then we feel insecure. Our guidance and our decisions are based on what is going to be happening with our enemy. So it's very dependent on our enemy's actions or reactions. So it's all over the place. Your decisions are out of your control because they are based on your enemy's actions, right? And then our perspective in life is very, very, it's just narrow. It's very distorted. There's only one thing and one way. So it's very defensive. There's always like a wall or a block up, right? And our power it's just very, very limited because it's completely dependent on another person or company or whatever the enemy is for you. The last centered way that we're going to talk about is church-centered.
And this is little Navy mommy's sister.
That is little Navy mom. So the next way to be centered is church-centered. And if we're church-centered, our security is completely based on the church's activity and the perceptions of people within the church for us, right?
Look what I just found.
So if we are church-centered, our guidance can be based on whether or not we whether or not the people in our church or God believe that what we're doing is good. So our decisions will be based on that. So it will be based on whether or not we think the people in our church will approve of our decisions. And then our life perspective is kind of black and white. It's kind of like believers versus non-believers, or people who are doing well and are good versus people who are not and who are bad. And then you can see where your power would be limited, because you would only believe that what your role or position within the church, or your level of adherence or obedience to the church teachings and saying and expectations are followed. So that's where your power would come from. So your position or your role. Now there is one more centered. So there is friend-centered, and friend-centered is similar to spouse. So our security is volatile as well, because it is based on someone else's needs or someone else's mood. And then our decisions are all guided on whether or not it increases our social status or reduces our social status. Does it make us feel embarrassed? Does it make us feel proud, based on what our friends think? So then you can see that our wisdom or our life perspective would be very stunted or limited, because it would be based on our social circle, and it would be based on our social status. So our life perspective would be on our experiences and our friends and our social circle's experiences. So that would be our whole life perspective. And then our power would be limited, because it in the same way with our spouse-centered, it's limited by other people's faults, weaknesses, experiences, and our own as well. So if we are any of these centers, which usually we fall into one, even if it changes throughout our lifetime, if we are focused on this center, you can see how we are very limited in our power, we are very limited in our potential. So I'm going to present to you today a principle-centered way of life, and that comes from Stephen Covey in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And a principle-centered life is focusing on our principles rather than something like our work, our money, our possessions, our friends, or anything like that, right? So it is based on principles. So we determine our principles, and that may be making a difference in other people's lives. It may be integrity. It may be truth. It may be freedom. And we decide on our principle and our principles based on our values, and they're very specific to you. You can easily just Google how to determine my principles, and you'll see different, or you can look at different lists and see what is best for you. And so with a principle-centered life, it is so great because our security is not based on something that is ever changing. And so your security is always there. So your principles are a lighthouse, and your security is based on your contribution, your growth towards those principles. But you know where you're going. It's not changing. It's repeatable. It's you can follow it. So your decisions are based on accurate data. Your decisions are based on no one else or other circumstances. They are based on your truest, highest values. So you can see how that makes decisions much easier and much more achievable, right? Because you know exactly where you're going, and you know that your decisions are going to be determined on just concise principles, right? So not on another person or another person's values, another person's reaction. So they're based on your values and bringing you closer to your goals in your life, right? So your judgment and your life perspective it's much broader, it's much more long term, and it's based on the consequences of your actions. So your perspective has more of a balance, and you can see where is this decision going to bring me here, and is this going to bring me there. So it's more just wise and balanced. And you see the world through a view of the terms of people, of what can you do in this world to help other people and to bring your values out into the world, right? So your values are generally going to be great for other people. If you have integrity, if you have truth, freedom, making a difference in other people's lives, right? These are things that are going to be bringing greatness into the world, right? And then your power, you can see, is not really limited. So it's only really limited on your understanding of the principles. So, and the natural consequences of those principles. So it's really only limited by that. So there's not that boxing you in other ways. So it's the more that you learn, the more that you contribute, the more that you're able to live by those principles, your potential just expands, right? So it's not completely limited or stifled down by other people or other things in your life or circumstances in your life. And so your ability to act becomes much more interdependent in the world, right? So you have your independence, but you have your connected relationships within the world. And so your power becomes greater and greater because of your ability to create this interconnected web for you. And so you're not limited by the things that you would have been limited in a spouse-centered or friend-centered or a family-centered or possession-centered or money-centered life. And some people become a little bit hesitant when we're saying, oh, well, then so I'm just not going to care about money, possessions. I'm not going to care about my friends. I'm not going to care about my church, my family, my spouse. These things are extremely important to me. Absolutely not. When you're principle-centered, you then see where all your roles fit in and how you balance those roles within your principle center. So you're a more complete and balanced person rather than only focused on what your family thinks about you, only focused on how your relationship is going to work in this situation. No, we have a principle, and all of your roles as a wife, a mother, an entrepreneur, a community person, a churchgoer, those roles all fit in to your principle and all are balanced and considered within your principle, right? So it's a much more holistic way of living your life. So within your principle, how can your role as a mother achieve this value? How can your role as in the company achieve this value? But you're always thinking of your value as the end goal. And so in this, we think about how those roles can play an important part in our mission. And from that, then we can live our life based on these principles and values. So I would implore you to figure out what your principles are. I would just sit with a notebook, brainstorm. What are your principles and how can your roles fulfill those principles? And that is how we can create kind of this limitless, solid foundation for us. And so one thing that kind of gets in our way when we are trying to create this principle-centered life is our limiting beliefs. And so I've created a free PDF for you that helps you release limiting beliefs. I'll just link it below here. But if you have any questions about how to shift your life to principle-based living versus how to kind of retract from those like spouse-centered living, family-centered living, those, leave a comment, send me a message. I love to chat about how we can do this. But where we want to start is figuring out what our principles are and making decisions from that principle from now on and seeing how our roles fit into that principle. But grab your free PDF to release your limiting beliefs, because those are things that really, really keep you stuck living in one certain way. You might have limiting beliefs that make you think, okay, but I can't go outside of what my family or my friends think. that will shatter my whole life, right? There are little limiting beliefs that we can start to get rid of that will help you step closer into a principle-centered life. So I hope you liked this video, and I hope that this improves your life, and you can use this to your advantage. If you have any questions, again, just leave a comment, and I will talk to you soon.